My name's Sean Hadley. I'm the president of PRSA St. Louis chapter, and I'm joined by former Ferguson Mayor James Knowles. Real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and do a technology update for you guys, for everybody that's listening. To allow for time, we ask you to keep your phones muted during the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question related to the topic, please feel free to submit it via the chat. Or raise your hand. If you're unable to submit via chat, go ahead and again raise your hand and we'll unmute you and we will have you come in. Please remember to be respectful to others who may also have questions. We're going to just have a quick discussion here, and we will take questions after we get through the question and answer process here with former Mayor James Knowles. So real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelist. It's Mr. James Knowles. He is the former mayor of Ferguson. He's 40 years old. He's been a resident of Ferguson for pretty much all of his life. Graduated from Truman State University with a degree in political science and criminal justice. Has his master's in public policy administration from the University of Missouri St. Louis. Mayor Knowles began his career in public service, starting as an intern and then legislative assistant in the Missouri Senate. In 2005, at age of 25 years old, he was elected to the youngest council member in the history of the City of Ferguson. 6 years later, he defeated the former mayor and local businessman to become the youngest mayor in the St. Louis region. He was reelected in 2014 and again in 2017 to his final term due to term limits in the Ferguson City Charter. So during his tenure in office, Mayor Knowles led his community through the response and rebuilding after two major tornadoes swept across his community in 2011, again in 2013, during the prolonged period of civil unrest following the death of Michael Brown. In August 2014, Mayor Knowles worked with a broad group of community leaders and activists to calm community tensions, reflect on the state affairs of his community, and institute reforms aimed at bridging the divide that tore through the community. Mayor Knowles also served as an active board member of several East-West Gateway Council of Government, Metro Mayors of St. Louis and St. Louis County Economic Development. Mayor Knowles has a very extensive bio, and that was a long one there. So we'll go ahead and get started here.
You told me we had to fill an hour, so I wrote a big bio.
Yeah, I probably should have cut that short. So,
sorry.
So we're here to talk about crisis communications and how it dealt with the City of Ferguson. And since you being the former mayor of Ferguson, dealing with this whole situation that happened with the death of Michael Brown and everything, all the activities that surrounded that issue, we're going to go ahead and dive in and discuss this. So if you can go ahead and set the stage for me, Mayor Knowles, give us a little background about the City of Ferguson and how it's structured as far as the city management, how the whole government's structured there.
Sure. So Ferguson is a council manager form of government, which it's one of the oldest ones actually in Missouri. We adopted a home rule charter in 1954, and we adopted a city manager form of government in which the city council, which is comprised of 6 members of the city council that are chosen by wards. There's 2 from each ward, and then a mayor who serves elected at large to preside over the council. The day-to-day operations of the city are actually conducted by a city manager or a professional manager, which is hired by the mayor and council to do the day-to-day activities, lead the staff. They handle more or less the executive authority of the city. As mayor, I'm the chief administrative officer, or I'm sorry, the chief elected official of the city, and I preside over the council. But I, at the time, under the charter, except in times of civil emergency, don't have any day-to-day administrative duties within City Hall. Those are done through the city manager. So I tell people, if you imagine a corporation in the United States, the mayor is the chairman of the board of directors for this company. The council is the board of directors for the company. We hire a city manager as the CEO, and he runs it day to day. Of course, he's accountable to us, and if we don't like what he's doing, we fire him. So, so that's the relationship of how the government structure works in the city of Ferguson.
Okay, And then, so with regards to the city of Ferguson, is the communications aspect of it, like public relations? Do you have a public affairs? Did you guys have a public affairs department, communications persons, public
Sure.
relations specialists, or anything, any of those types?
So, I was elected in '05, and in my 15 years that I was there, at times we did have, a public relations coordinator, and that person uh, typically handled kind of like the fluff uh, promotions of city events and community events. We, you know, day to day issues that might, well, first of all, we didn't have crises day to day back in 2005, back before 2014. But primarily, if we had an incident, most of those incidents would be police related. An accident maybe that involved a fatality. We didn't have any police shootings before 2014. Um, if there was a murder in town, which happened seldomly before 2014, those sorts of things were usually handled by public information trained officer at the police department. Um, all of the community activities that we did and all the things that we did, mostly through Parks and Rec, through our festivals, through our business district, those things were all handled by our community, our public relations coordinator that we had. Unfortunately, sometime around 2010, through budget cuts, that ended up being a position that was cut, and that after that point, pretty much promotions for any events that were going on in the community were kind of the purview of whatever department head or whatever department of the city was handling an event. So um, by the time 2014 came along, we didn't have any kind of public relations apparatus in place. There was civil emergencies in Ferguson. We had become very adept at dealing with natural disasters, and the communication through those were through our emergency coordinator, our emergency preparedness coordinator, through our fire department. Very different sort of communications than existed and what was required after the incident in August of 2014 and the ensuing civil unrest. So um, we were very ill prepared on August 9th, 2014 to deal with the communication aspects of how to respond to, a tragic incident like this. And then after that, the unrest and the conversation that followed, it caught us all off guard.
Okay. So walk us through like August 9th, 2014, that day. And then when you when you were pretty much pulled into the fray and involved in this whole situation with not having a communications person. I can speak on this topic as well because again, my past career, I was actually in the media covering this whole incident and kind of dealt with it on the other side of not having that person to contact and reach out to get the information we needed, direct contact, because again, like you explained, there was no PR person there or no
Right.
public information officer. So walk us through August 9th, 2014, when you got involved.
Sure. So August 9th was a Saturday. It happened to be a nice day. I was down helping tear down the tents at the farmers market when I got a call from our city manager, who himself was out of the area, but he was still in contact, to let us know that there had been an incident that involved a shooting with one of our officers. We did not have any information as far as whether the person was armed, if how old the individual was. But at that point, I was notified. It was probably about 12:30, 12:45. It was shortly after the farmers market had ended. The city manager had told me he's going to be coming back into City Hall, and that we would meet up and talk about what's going to go on from there. He had told me at that time also that St. Louis County was going to be handling the investigation because obviously for optics and just for keeping everybody honest, we wanted to make sure that an outside agency was going to be conducting the investigation, and therefore also we expected them to be handling the communications regarding it, largely. Um, the ironic thing was, it was that afternoon, by the time I had gotten home, that I started seeing, the stories that were already posted, the initial stories that were posted online, and the comments that were being said as part of the stories. And these comments were being driven by social media and others that were sharing it. And there was this fog of this information blackout because what was going on. Uh, most people are familiar with. It took forever to get investigators down to the scene. It took forever to get the coroner down there. So for 4 hours, there was this standoff of people that were uh, seeing the investigation, the incident unfold, and then a law enforcement presence there. And so as that grew and built and continued to build, I saw a lot of information on social media. That was where most of our information was coming from, even to the city. The commanders on the ground did not have time to sit here and give, city manager and I a play-by-play of what was going on. And then we started seeing immediately just these kind of stories unfold and this narrative unfold of what people heard happened or saw it happened, and really see that take hold on social media and throughout the comment section of a lot of the media outlets. We didn't make any comments at that point. We actually, the next day, there was a press conference with our chief and Chief Belmar. At the time, like I said, we felt they were better equipped to deal with the situation, and they were going to be handling the investigation. So we immediately took that opportunity for Chief Belmar the next day to discuss what they knew at that point and how they were going to go forward with it. But pretty soon after that, we continued to get contacted by media from around the area and pretty quickly from around the country. That Sunday, I think I had already been contacted by national media outlets, including one that had invited me to go on next week. I think it was Meet the Press that I got invited to go on, which I declined. At that time, we had hoped that the investigation would ensue, and this conversation would kind of calm down to a point where the officers can do their job and we could hold people accountable for anything that went on that might have been illegal. That Sunday night, though, that's when the vigil happened that got out of control. The law enforcement presence. There was a large vigil that happened near the Quick Trip, where social media had said the incident occurred. Social media had said that Michael Brown had robbed the Quick Trip, which is why the vigil was at the Quick Trip or by the Quick Trip, and that's where the incident, that he was leaving Quick Trip when this occurred. And that night, a vigil occurred there. There was a strong militarized kind of law enforcement presence. It ended up becoming, getting out of hand. Tear gas flew, and the Quick Trip was set ablaze. And shortly after that, any hopes of this kind of calming down while an investigation happened were right out the window. And after that, it was just, the media was hounding us every day, for comments, for information, for anything they get their hands on.
I was one of them, so I understand that completely. But
And I still talk to you because I like it.
So you said something very interesting here. You said you guys tried to hand it off to St. Louis County for the investigation and communications. Well, I can speak directly and say that didn't take place because you guys were still commenting, meaning the police chief, and the kind of the narratives that were going on around that. We had several different people talking on this whole thing. When did the City of Ferguson realize that they needed to bring in some sort of public relations, expert help here at this point? Because
this is the problem with law enforcement, is they all have their contacts in the media, and they use them and they get used, and they're used to kind of speaking as it relates to these sort of incidents. Like I mentioned, there wasn't a communications plan in the city of Ferguson, nor was there an apparatus where we would say, when an event happens, this goes through the city manager or the mayor or PR person's office before before a comment's made. I mean, I think it's that chief and our chief at the time, and then a lot of law enforcement are used to, somebody comes up and there's a shooting, they talk about it, they respond to it. Um, the fact that it was a shooting involving one of our officers, it should have taken a little bit different tact, and I obviously had to deal with it because this isn't us looking on the outside of like an incident and commenting on it or talking about the investigation. This is our officer. We're implicated in this until the facts come out of as to what happened, or maybe the facts would come out and say that and obviously it could have been his fault. And so there was a control issue, and that at that time, keeping not just the chief, and the chief was making public comments early in which we asked him to stop, but there were officers throughout the department who obviously were making comments. And that wasn't just in our department. There was a lot of comments being made through county. There was a lot of things I learned about county from reporters who came to me and said, I'm hearing this from county, what do you know, or what can you tell me? And the answer should be I should keep my mouth shut, but reporters like to pump you for information. They like to feed you a little bit too, to see if you can get you to say more. It was in the first few days that we realized pretty quickly that there was a need not just for media literacy or and public relations kind of literacy within our staff, but we needed to have somebody coordinating this. We had a tremendous number of requests for interviews that come through, a tremendous number of sunshine law requests for information, and both funneling requests in and then messaging, making a message, mapping that out and putting that out needed to happen, and nobody in City Hall was prepared to do that or able to do that. So we brought in a local firm here within the St. Louis region. Sean told me not to use firm names, so we won't say firm names, but we brought in a firm shortly after that, and they did an admirable job. They came from St. Louis County Economic Council, actually had been using them. St. Louis County had seen this as not just a problem for Ferguson, but all of North St. Louis County and maybe even St. Louis, that this issue is being elevated to a point where, it's not just making Ferguson or this officer or that neighborhood look bad. This is going to make North County look bad and St. Louis region look bad. So we worked with them at first. We were immediately criticized because the firm, was not a minority firm, and quite frankly, even though the community at the time was about 65% African American, we only had one African American city council member at the time. We had no command staff in our police department that were African American. We had a few people in City Hall department heads in City Hall who were African American, but they weren't they weren't the spokesperson of the city. And so again, for optics reasons, we needed to be culturally sensitive and understand that how this looked, to not just the St. Louis region, but the world. We wanted to make sure that, we were engaging someone to help us be more adept to those sorts of those issues. We didn't have, even as a community, and I've lived in Ferguson, as Rashawn said, all my life. I went to a school that was a majority, African American. I had won at that point 5 elections in Ferguson. Coached high school wrestling at McClure South Berkeley. My entire wrestling team was African American. That didn't matter. Those sorts of things. None of those things when we had talked in the past or when we'd had conversations in the community, nobody ever said like, well, Mayor, but you're white. But that was said a lot after that. That was said to people on the outside. I mean, I hate to say it, I look like FW de Klerk or something, and, that really wasn't the case. But that, again, was part of the optics, and understanding at that point that I wasn't talking to residents that knew me. I was talking to the St. Louis region, and I was talking to our country, and in many cases, the world. And, how do I communicate with people who aren't familiar with our community and how to do so succinctly and how to do so in sound bites that the media can pick up on, and also not say things that the media will pick out and make you look even worse than you already do by yourself. So we did bring in a minority firm that was also under contract with St. Louis County. That firm ended up they're not active in St. Louis anymore, but the firm actually had their own skeletons or their own issues, um, and unfortunately, those issues ended up becoming the city's issues, and those things were. Um, became yet another issue for the city of Ferguson. Um, we had to drop that firm, and we were again right up until the grand jury announcement. We were without uh, any professional PR assistance, and as much as we tried to control the messaging coming out of the city, the police department was probably the worst. There was still things coming out of the police department and interviews being given and things being said that um, hurt us in the long run. And so shortly after the grand jury announcement, we did bring in a firm that worked for us for quite some time. And they did an admirable job of helping us in the aftermath, really, with and there was a minority firm here from St. Louis that helped us in the aftermath, really plan the messaging once the grand jury announcement was behind us. And they stayed with us for some time until again we found ourselves in a situation where we couldn't justify financially keeping a PR firm when we were having difficulty with other financial problems in the city.
Okay. So you guys didn't take any time. I mean, obviously, with everything going on, you didn't have time to vet out firms and kind of figure out what you wanted. But optic wise, you felt like you need to have a minority firm here just to kind of smooth things over, to speak. Going forward, though, as far as when you brought that firm in, I mean, you and I have had several discussions about this. As far as like walking through the community and dealing with the media, I'm going to touch base on something that you would have brought up as far as how the media would take words and play them into what they make it a narrative of what they wanted it to be to make the story look better than what it actually was going on. One thing you can we'll go ahead and call it networks here. CNN was a big one that was there for you that was all over this. And talk about the discussions you've had when you're walking through the community, obviously trying to be out there smoothing things over with the people and everything, and that narrative of the world now not knowing about Ferguson. Because I can speak for, again, on personal experiences. I know when everything was going on, when the civil unrest was happening, people, Ferguson's burning down. I had friends calling me from all over, from Iowa to California. Oh my God, St. Louis is burning down. And I'm like, it's Ferguson, and it's like 25 minutes away from where I live, and it's a little pocket. It's nothing, But talk about, again, running into reporters and not having that protection of trained public relations specialists.
Well, as a politician, number one, you tend to talk too much, and that's just never good with reporters. So it's always good to have somebody there that says, or this interview is because it's always hard for, politicians, number one. But additionally, though, sometimes when you're being confronted with something, or you in your everyday life, or having conversation with an individual, as long as when you're having a conversation with an individual and you feel like you both are, you both believe your intentions are pure, and nobody's going to take what I say and try to twist it, you probably don't think what you say is going to get twisted. And if it does, then you can at least continue the conversation to try to, make sure that both people in the conversation are clear. On multiple occasions, conversations that we had with reporters, it was clear that a 5-minute or a 10-minute or a 20-minute long interview, which they play, 35 seconds of, or even, 90 seconds of, and then they expound upon what you said. It was really clear that they were less concerned with what my intent was and more concerned with, well, he said this, we can find a way to make him look even worse. I can do that all by myself, right? We politicians can do that. There was an incident I recalled to you yesterday that uh, where Chris Cuomo, during an interview, we'd done a long format kind of interview, uh, had baited me when we were talking about Michael Brown's body being left out on the street for 4 hours. And he said to me, he says, well, you guys left Michael Brown's body in the street for 4 hours. Why would you do that why would you do that? I mean, you left it out there. You left it out there. And my response was, well, we left it out there because the coroner couldn't make it. And there was a number of issues. Number one, we didn't get the investigator didn't get there in time. The coroner didn't make it in time. All this got dragged out. We wanted to preserve the crime scene. He seized on the fact that I referred to Michael Brown's body as it. And he says, you mean Michael Brown, right? You mean, you called it it, you mean him. And I just froze. I said, yeah. But I responded to his body, his body being in the street as it, as he had just done. But by doing that, he baited me into saying, referring to him as it. And then, of course, what do they play on TV is, he doesn't even think he's a person. He calls his body an it. And I just thought, what a jerk. I would have never thought that it was, that it was that bad, this kind of gotcha game. Chris Hayes, not Chris Hayes in Fox 2, who I adore, he's a good guy, but Chris Hayes over at, I think, Metro PC.
Yeah.
He wanted to do an interview and wanted to do a walk around town. And we went and I showed him and his crew the whole city. We went to the biggest homes, the smallest homes in Ferguson. And as we're walking down the street of all the big Victorian homes, he says, so, Mayor, this is where all the white people live, huh? And I just stopped him. I said, well, no, but if you want to go knock on the door, and I don't know if some of you guys know, like Dr. Lori Punch, she's a member of the St. Louis County Police Board. And like, she lives, there was African-American doctors and lawyers who live all up and down these streets in these big homes. But, he wanted to show that there was a big, rich, white part of town, which there wasn't, because those neighborhoods were, full of, well-to-do people of both, both black and white, and that there was just, poor African-American part of town. I think if I would have had a PR person with me, obviously at the time, it was just me, a producer, a camera guy, and Chris, right? If I would have had somebody with me at the time, maybe they would have told me not to do that interview, or maybe they would have, been able to stay on him and his people about, how this was portrayed. Of course, regardless of what I said at that moment, they ran with the optics of, here's the wealthy part, which is where white people live, and here's the poor part where African Americans live. Hence this huge divide in our community. But I mean, there was, multiple instances that continued. The local people, much different. The national people were much more that gotcha game. The local people were much more interested in getting to, I think, more of an accurate depiction of what was happening.
Yeah. So touch on, you talk about not having a PR person, and this is kind of where we go with this here is the value of having that trained expert and kind of the lessons learned here. I mean, I could break apart a lot of things here, but it's not my conversation to have. So I'm gonna let you kind of dive into some lessons learned here and kind of what going forward, where things are, the state of Ferguson is now. A lot of takeaways here as far as what took place and stuff like that. Just touch base on, dive a little bit more, and not having that person and you being a politician again and talking too much.
Sure. So I think one of the biggest takeaways is obviously when your job is not PR. I mean, you obviously need to be, situationally aware and culturally sensitive and all those things in your daily life anyway. But it's a different level, obviously, and that you are dealing with when you're dealing with, um, especially something at this level, and having a professional whose only focus is that, is key. There's a million things that go into the calculus of decision making, both as a politician, as an administrator, manager, whatever you're doing. um, Optics are part of it. Sometimes just as a mayor, as a politician, as a man, as a white man, whatever, it helps to have other perspectives, from the outside tell you, hey, you need to think about, how this looks to this individual or this group. Uh, maybe it sounded good in your head, but it didn't come out good. Having a professional to help you with that, and then also, of course, helping you prepare. Probably not just um, not just helping do the things like, intake's a big issue, right? We have tons of requests that come in, vetting these requests, really understanding who to talk to, who not to talk to, having people maybe having a professional who can kind of digest, or kind of uh, foresee maybe where they're going with maybe their lines of questioning before you get, sitting in this chair, with a camera on you, are all very important. And having that is an extremely important, precursor to then preparing you to actually speak, and preparing you to map, your message beforehand, and stay on message beforehand, and help prepare you and make you practice those sorts of things. um, it's almost like it's almost like a lawyer preparing somebody to be deposed, getting ready to stay on message, um, making sure that you don't get taken down roads that they want to go to, again, to get back to your message. But if you go into these without a message, without a plan, without that kind of preparations, both mentally and otherwise, um, you're going to be in deep trouble. And having somebody, no matter how good you think you are as a politician, or how adept you might be in speaking or anything else, it's really easy uh, to be taken down those roads by a skilled reporter. And so having a PR professional, I think, is paramount.
Well, and not just the media side of it. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of the optics here, to use that word, a lot of people think about public relations, that they just deal with just the media and just deal with, being able to go on camera, or deal with, just whatever pitches like that. But a lot of the bigger issue, though, too, the bigger thing that I think gets lost in this whole thing is the community. How are things communicated to the community at large? Not just Ferguson, but you talk about the St. Louis region. I mean, I'll bring in another key element here. Is the governor got involved at one point, and they had I guess at the time it was Governor Nixon was involved,
Nixon, yeah.
and the National Guard was brought in. Things that whole
Or wasn't first.
or wasn't, yeah, it wasn't as first too, but to the community, how were things communicated to the community? You bring a firm in, or bring one firm in, they don't do one thing, and you bring the next firm in, and I mean it's kind of like a spiral effect here. But what was the message to the community at large? How are you guys able to communicate to them?
Sure. So communicating through the media was difficult. Again, because whatever you're saying is going and being digested through the media machine and then spat out, and it may not come out the way, again, that you put it out there. Using social media, which we used direct mail, we used direct email. We have at the time we had a lot more. Sadly, we don't have as much anymore, but we had a number of very active neighborhood groups. And those groups met throughout the unrest. And so, myself and others, we made sure we were there, having those presences, that presence at those neighborhood meetings, speaking to people in small groups, face to face, telling them what was going on, what we can expect, answering their questions, in large part, oftentimes just listening, in times like that, sometimes listening, uh, you obviously had people that wanted to know information. You had other people that just wanted to be heard. And so there's that kind of there's kind of two parts to that. Um, just like there's a divide in America, unfortunately, there was a huge divide, across um, St. Louis and obviously in our community too, there were people. It was very difficult to separate those who were actually in our community, like in our city, versus people who had come to our community or our city. Um, Not that their voice, not that people from outside the community are any less important to hear, but it is a different conversation. And, it's like having a conversation with, your sister or your cousin, right? I mean, the people that live in our city are our immediate family who we work with, do things with every day, who have interactions with City Hall every day, interactions with our police every day. And then there's people from the area that, are familiar with Ferguson, they've been through Ferguson, maybe they go to shop at Ferguson Walmart, but they don't go down to the brew house. They don't show up at the farmer's market. They're not at the 4th of July festival. They're not at Street Fest. They've never voted in our election. They've never been knocked on their door because they don't live in Ferguson. Those are difficult. So there were different, I won't say there's different messaging, but clearly different um, methods in which we would reach those groups, because so many of the people that showed up to some of our events were not Ferguson residents. And so oftentimes in town hall meetings, we had people from literally all over the country who showed up at our meetings. But we listened to them. We tried to engage them. We tried to speak to them. Um, we tried to put out information out there. It was difficult in large part in those formats, especially early on, because there was so much hostility from people who would show up at those kind of events. And so when we show up and we try to have uh, when we try to put out information to residents in those meetings, a lot of residents, frankly, we got very disheartened and frustrated because they'd show up for a dialogue or they'd show up for a conversation and it would be hijacked by shenanigans or people screaming and hollering or flailing about or acting whatever for the camera. And a lot of frustrated residents would just leave disgusted or leave frustrated and or not show up at the next meetings. And that happened for months and months, even after the unrest, where people just got frustrated showing up to try to do something positive, only to have people who showed up and were disruptive. So we had to find other ways oftentimes to reach those residents. And like I said, neighborhood association meetings, direct emails, we'd send texts. We did a number of things to just try to push information out directly to people versus going through, media outlets, which was part of it. But at least those attempts and those formats of getting that information out were more true to what our message was. And again, the format coming back to us, was a little bit, people would email quite a bit. They would call. Having those conversations with people were oftentimes more fruitful than, again, having 200 people in a room, 100 of them that want to hear what you have to say and 100 of them that, want to perform for CNN. So,
well, and you talk about the whole communicating with the community. What for this audience? What more, like, as far as like with these firms you had, again going back to the PR firms, what role did they really play in helping you guys along the way, or were they any help at all? Was it just their?
No, they were. So part of what they, besides just intake, again, we literally would get 1,000 requests in a week for media. I mean, whether it was, Vox News, Al Jazeera, Pravda, from Russia, it was just nuts. So besides, taking that in, kind of digesting it and deciding how or what we're going to respond to, probably the one firm that we were with the longest, one of the things that they did that was very beneficial was they helped us make those connections in the community to allow us to have more. I mean, for lack of a better term, I'll call them surrogates, who are not city officials, to help us, reach out to the community, to help connect with members of the community, to help connect with, circles in the community that, as I mentioned, neighborhood groups and whatnot. We had a number of people involved in the clergy who were very helpful in putting together groups of people, conversations, meetings. They get together for the big press conferences. They'd show up and stand behind us. It was a much more diverse look. It was a much more inclusive group. They were people who had standing in the community, not just in Ferguson, but in the broader St. Louis community. People who would help us, work with people who who were really legitimately there to have a conversation. They helped us make those relationships. They helped make those contacts. They helped set up those meetings. They helped set up those conversations and those discussions. The media firm was really excellent in doing that, and that was important because even though that's not something you see in the headlines of Post Dispatch or any of those other groups, those conversations and that outreach to the community, as you mentioned, Sean, is,
Mhm.
you know, it wasn't, I don't want to say it wasn't a media win because it wasn't, but it was a city win because it was effective. Because ultimately, the community was able to calm a lot of its tensions in our community. We were able to get back to a functioning city government and a functioning relationship. We were able to, um, I think people in the community were able to see that the city was, in fact, operating in a manner that was, working towards reform, and that we were, certainly had our best intentions, certainly make mistakes like anybody along the way, but we were operating in good faith. Um, Personally, I don't know however you want to measure this, but I mean, I will say I take it that I feel like the success of that outreach is borne out by the fact that I won re-election. I mean, they spent $50,000 to try to recall me. I mean, they had hundreds of people getting signatures. They couldn't get enough signatures to have me recalled. I mean, if you read the New York Times, I was like the worst mayor in America. And, I probably screwed up plenty, and I certainly did. But my community, and it's a very low threshold, they wouldn't sign enough signatures to have me recalled. And then the next year I won by 15 points, in a community by that time, which was, 75% African American.
But you go back to it goes back to the optics of things, though, like what you're saying here with the community. Um, that communication with the community and knowing that how strong Ferguson is, as a community again, is something to behold, and something a lot of people don't really realize. And you know, that narrative that you're painting here, as far as when the national media comes in and starts to just tear apart things and try and figure out what's going on, and then go on to the next thing. I know that firsthand, but again, it's kind of one of those things where they the media side of it doesn't care about the community. They care about telling the best story they can at large. And you look at the whole local media side of it, because there's a big thing here with the local media and the national media. The local media is always going to be here and stay here and has to still deal with those things. The national media usually messes things up for the local media on a front, and I think that's where you guys are right now, is how to deal with things. I mean, we're winding down, but this I'm going to pivot here real quick. So, you turned out, you couldn't run for re-election, everything. Now the narrative you have here is, we have the first female Black mayor of Ferguson, who was a council member and ran for for mayor. And
And
going
that's who
back
she,
to,
she ran against me the first time.
yes, but going back to the whole thing of how Ferguson is run, that not to use the word that the mayor's the figurehead, but the mayor is not the day-to-day operations, but you kind of got spun into some things because of
Sure.
the civil unrest that took place. Um, Speak a little bit about where Ferguson is today.
Sure. Well, we still have, so after the civil unrest, and um, March, I believe, of 2015, we had the Justice Department issue its report on the Ferguson Police Department simultaneously with their report on the civil rights investigation into the shooting of Michael Brown. They stated that there was nothing that they would say that had done to violate Michael Brown's civil rights. However, they had said that there were numerous violations that they felt the City of Ferguson Police Department as a whole had done. So that ended up becoming a conversation as part of our reform efforts, and culminated in a consent decree with the federal government. And so currently they're in year 5 of this federal consent decree. And this consent decree, um, it outlines a number of reforms, and many of which we had already had begun, but it outlines a number of reforms that the city had needed to undertake and continues to undertake, or they more or less could be released from the um, supervision of the Department of Justice. So that's ongoing. That does continue to be quite a drag on the finances of the city. We pay for an outside monitoring company to monitor our progress and our adherence to that. It would be nice if the federal government was doing that, but we don't. We hire an outside group that we agreed with the federal government to actually audit us basically on a daily basis to ensure compliance with the aspects of the consent decree. So that compliance monitoring costs quite a bit. Not to mention that a number of the items that were part of the reform efforts, including having body cameras and other things, continue to be a financial, burden on the city. That being said, those have, I think, paid dividends in many ways to improving not just the community police relationship, but just in general, as I think improved policing in the city to some extent. However, just like every community in St. Louis, especially right now with the pandemic, there are serious financial constraints. Sales tax is one of the big funders of a lot of municipal governments here in St. Louis. Ferguson is, of course, one of them. And, the COVID shutdowns and the pandemic has really strained the finances of all cities in St. Louis. And that continues to bear on Ferguson. There's a lot of conversation. I was the immediate past president of the St. Louis County Municipal League. One of the things we've been pushing is to have the state enact what they call the Wayfair bill, Wayfair being the online retail company, to have a statewide municipal use tax or sales tax, essentially, for internet purchases. That is the wave of the future. Cities that depend on retail sales to fund city government are going to be required to get with the 21st century. And things that we're losing, purchases that we're losing in the old brick and mortar stores within our communities that are going online, that revenue is going to have to be captured somehow. Otherwise, you're going to see communities across the area continue to struggle financially. And so a lot of the problems that Ferguson has is not unique to Ferguson. The consent decree is unique to Ferguson. North County in general, I think still has, an issue to deal with some of the stigma associated both with the unrest and just the parochialism of St. Louis County in general. I mean, everybody's lives in their silos of you're either northeast, west, south, whatever. So, but property values are going up. We've had a number of good businesses that have moved in the past few years. I know that currently there's a number of really good economic development prospects on the horizon for Ferguson. And I think that will continue. I think over the next several years, assuming the economy continues to grow and hopefully we get past some of these issues with COVID. The area along West Florissant where was the epicenter of the unrest for all those months in the summer and fall of 2014. That is now the home to a Boys and Girls Club. There's also a medical facility that Mercy's been working on maybe 4 or 5 years now, but they've actually broke ground on it now. And so there is a massive redevelopment effort along that corridor as well, which I think will hopefully spur some economic development, some jobs, and access to some really important resources for the people in the community that was most affected by the unrest in 2014.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, we talk about where we are in the state today and everything. We're gonna wrap up here. Today, still, do they have a does the city of Ferguson employ a communications person? Have a communications firm? Are they just kind of a wait and see? Are they still in the wait and see method again here? Just wrap up here. Just kind of where we ended.
Sure. Well, they're in the middle of hiring a new city manager at the moment. So we'd hired a city manager after the city manager in 2014 had resigned shortly after the consent decree, or rather the Justice Department report. We had a city manager for a few years after that. He resigned about a year ago. And so we've had an interim ever since. So it'll be interesting to see what the new city manager does. They're, I think, expected to hire the new one here at the end of March. So really that new city manager will be the person that sets the table for how the government of Ferguson is structured, and how administratively they deal with all the different tasks that need to be done. And one of the big ones is public relations, how we communicate with not just our community, but every year in August, it's the anniversary, and every time something happens anywhere in the United States, I still get calls every time an unfortunate incident occurs with law enforcement in the United States, wanting my thoughts or wanting me to weigh in on it. Believe it or not, I've learned to keep my mouth shut mostly.
I hear you there. So we'll open up for any questions if there's any questions at this time, and I'll also add to that. So Ferguson is not like the Mayor Knowles said here. Ferguson's not the north. It's not an individual. I mean, there's over 88 municipalities in St. Louis County, and a lot of them function pretty much the same way as far as city manager led government and lack of communications people, staff, to say the least. But it's just because they don't know they need it till they need it, and I'll leave it at that. So, but I'll open up if there's any questions or anything for Mr. Knowles before we close out.
For anybody who has a firm, it would be smart for me. It would be smart for municipalities to maybe have at least somebody on retainer at all times, if not actively doing something for whenever something happens.
Going back real quick, the National Guard question I'd asked you about, just touch base. So the National Guard was brought in, not to get real long-winded on this one, but when the National Guard was brought in, who was in charge of communicating that to the community? Was that at that point, was that when the state took over, or kind of whatever took place? That was a question that kind of came up.
One of the biggest problems that we had at that time, you might remember, they had the quote unified command, and that unified command involved St. Louis County and Highway Patrol. St. Louis City was involved in it at one point because they had contributed a number of officers to the entire response. And then, there was also participation from other municipalities who had obviously also gave officers to this response effort. The most frustrating part about all this was the governor took over control, but then didn't want to take responsibility. And I mean, legally, there was a declaration, an emergency declaration established. Legal command and control was, they were the biggest dog on the block and they were in control. Whether it was, General Danner, with the National Guard, or at the time there was, Ron Johnson. And then there was, Colonel Brett. I can't remember Brett's last name, but he was the superintendent, later became the superintendent of Highway Patrol. There was kind of at one point like this trifecta of people running things. And They were also handling communication, but there were so many agencies and so many organizations involved. And again, it goes back to this conversation we had earlier about people who have connections with the media. You couldn't get them to shut up, and our staff included, our police chief included. I mean,
Yeah.
every police chief who sent officers to, these code 1000, the code 2000, code 3000 that they had, every one of them had nuggets of information, and every one of them got a call from, all the different reporters, and every one of them had something to say at some point off the record. And so it was really difficult to control that. It was almost impossible, especially because there was not a strong message coming out of the unified command. And when the unrest happened, the governor, instead of standing up there in front of all this, there was an interview that's kind of famous that he gave where he 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 refused to say that he was in control. He took control. I mean, legal functional control of the situation. And they interviewed him and they said, well, so who's in control of this? Who's handling this? And he said, well, I don't really personalize it like that. And he stuttered through it for about 5 or 6 minutes. And that was, I mean, that's really just indicative, not just of the communications aspect of it, but of the whole, the whole incident. I think there was a lot of people who were afraid to get close to what they thought was an unwinnable situation. And so if you didn't have to give an interview on this, you didn't want to. I mean, nobody wanted to be Chris Cuomo, or not Chris Cuomo, not Mario Cuomo, whichever the governor is now.
Andrew Cuomo, yeah.
Andrew Cuomo. Nobody wanted to be the guy who gives a press conference every morning and talks about what's happening with Michael Brown. Nobody wanted to be the guy that had to go out there and be the face of what seemed to be an unwinnable PR nightmare. And so I think that's why you saw there was such lack of leadership. And that was all the way up, that was all the way to the governor.
Well, we have reached the end of our time and we're wrapping up. I don't see any other questions here. Appreciate the time and thank you for joining us. And it's been to me very informative to learn a lot about the lack thereof and lessons learned with the communications of not, or even not having communications, or getting the communications in there, but then getting the way taking control of the whole situation. So appreciate your time and thanks for the insightful conversation here.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar here with former Ferguson Mayor James Knowles. And thank you all for joining us. If there's no other questions, we are going to end the discussion. Thanks again, James, for joining us.
Thank you. Take care, Sean.
All right. Yeah.